All right, hi everybody. Welcome to this week's Snack and Chat. I'm a minute late, but that's all right. We are here and we're live with, of course, our host, Catherine Connors, and our guest today, Michelle Young from Children's Aid Society from London, Ontario. So today we're going to talk about a specific program that Michelle is running called Aunties and Uncles. So before we get to that, I just want to remind everyone that we are live on our public Facebook page. So what that means is we want you to ask questions. We want your feedback about what we're talking about. So make sure you put those in the chat, but you want to be mindful that that chat is available to the public. So the information you put in there, you want to make sure that it's not identifiable information. So for those of you that are new to Snack and Chat, we're here every Tuesday at 12:15, different guests, different topics. So we look forward to hearing more from Michelle. So I'm going to pass it over to Catherine, but actually before I do that, I want to let everyone know a little bit more about Michelle and the program. So she is the Director of Service, Ongoing Services, Indigenous Services and Equity Lead at Children's Aid Society of London, Ontario. In Michelle's 20 years in child protection, she worked in the areas of intake, ongoing foster, and adoption before moving into the role of Director of Service and Equity Lead for the Children's Aid Society of London and Middlesex in Ontario. Her passion has always been using her voice to challenge oppression and the status quo in all areas of her life. So thank you again, Michelle, for being here today. And now I will officially pass it over to Catherine.
Thank you, Chantel.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Michelle, for being here. I hope that my internet isn't finicky because we were having issues with it earlier. So just let me know if I'm sounding like a robot. Then I don't know, try and figure.
So was mine. Just so you know, like ours literally went out at one point yesterday for about 30 minutes. So we're hoping that won't happen.
We'll just make robot noises to each other for 45 minutes.
Sounds good.
So thank you so much for coming. You know, I've heard about the Aunties and Uncles program because there was a few articles that came out about it. And then obviously I heard you so eloquently speak on the panel, the permanency panel that Adopt for Life was a part of as well. And I'm really excited that something like this actually is in existence. And so we have questions about the program itself and then just general questions for you as well. So I'll start with number one. And then like I mentioned, I always end up rearing off stage to something else. So the first question I have is tell us a little bit more about the program and kind of where in the stages is it in its development?
So in case some people aren't familiar, so the program came about probably, I think we really thought it maybe about 4 years, 3-4 years ago. And I was covering for a colleague who had to go do a presentation trying to do recruiting for foster and adoptive parents. And it was the Congress of Black Women here in London, the London chapter. And I remember thinking, I'm familiar with some of the women because I've gone to some of their events, and I had the screen going, you know, the PowerPoint presentation, and partway through, I just stopped and thought, what am I doing? I said, because I looked at them, I'm like, you're like my mother's age. Most of you are older than me in the sense that, are you really wanting to adopt or foster? And that seems like a really big ask. And so I just thought, I threw it out there and I said, what if we had let's say a young 8-year-old girl who's Black, and she's placed with a family that's white, and they don't know how to do her hair. And so I asked the women, would that be something that you would be willing to do and participate in? It's sort of like a volunteer, and maybe a relationship would start, and you'd have them over to your house, and if there was a cultural match, you would make food, and they just kind of joining of the families in a sense. And they really took to that. And so in working with someone who was at the time, Jana at One Vision, One Voice, we met. And literally it was on a lunch and said, okay, I got this idea. And we had the same idea that in our culture and a lot of other cultures, as far as Black community, that aunties and uncles play a role, and you have aunties and uncles who you aren't necessarily biologically connected to. So it might be your mom or dad's best friend who's part of the family in a sense, and the role that they play. And I thought about for our son, we were very intentional in bringing people into his lives. And so he refers to he doesn't refer to adults by their first names. We're kind of old school that way. So it'll be, you know, Miss Chantel, and then depending on your relationship, it might be Auntie Catherine. So right away, he knows that person is safe and he's able to have that relationship with that person. So he does have like his Aunt Wheezy, who is white, who, you know, I had met at work and we stayed friends, who they have their own Christmas celebration. So before COVID, he would go over and spend time and spend the night, and she would treat him like a prince. And I said, well, it's better that you do it because that's not happening at my house. So it's good that he has those relationships. And so then you just sort of parlay that to thinking, okay, kids in care. Like for me, it's easy to do that. But children and youth in care who are not placed with families that look like them, or they're adopted by families who aren't the same racial background or cultural background, wouldn't it be great to have something like that? So sort of thinking it's like the Big Brother, Big Sisters, but we're really looking at wanting to make that specific connection, because we think about, you know, the murder of Rodney King. And I thought about right away, I had to have a conversation with my son. He wasn't necessarily watching the video, but we really tried not to have him see that. So he actually hasn't seen the video, but he needed to know what happened. And then we went to the protest that we had here in London, and masked up and everything. And for him to see all of these people, for him to understand how we got here, I really thought about who's having those conversations with the children and youth, the Black children and youth in care. And does their mother, adoptive, whatever, foster care provider feel equipped to have that conversation? Because most people weren't having conversations about race, period. And now we have this huge thing that happened, and we need to process that or help kids just have the conversation about it. And a lot of people didn't feel equipped to do that. I mean, just in general, as a parent, as a Black parent, having to have that conversation, you're like, okay, at the time he was 8. And so realizing, if we're thinking we have to have these conversations, how is it someone who doesn't have the same identity able to even think that they should navigate it? And we want to protect kids, right? So not want to have that conversation. I want to tell them it's okay. It doesn't matter. That was just a silly person, or that person doesn't represent everyone else, without really talking about the whole bigger picture of that and how that is just a depiction of what really is happening. So that's brought us to Aunties and Uncles, which had already sort of been in the slow-mo in the mix. We do have some matches. We're wanting to sort of move things forward. So we're really looking at working and partnering with another organization that's separate from us, and being able to really work together in bringing this to the forefront so that people do have that option. And for kids, because these can be like the ideal. So people do a 1-year commitment. So we want to have at least a 1-year commitment, and you can make a difference in a year. So I think about children who are in school, and they'll talk about that teacher. You know, you're an adult, and you say, in grade 4, Mrs. Green, you know, you're like, that's why I took up reading and writing. That's why I'm a writer. That's why I realized I could do math. It was that one person. And you think about how much time does a teacher actually spend, right? You have like a class from anywhere to 17 to 20 something children and youth in your class, but you're able to make that impact. So imagine if for a year, a child could know that they mattered, and that someone really saw them and was able to sort of walk through and give them that foundation, give them positive role modeling of someone who looks like them and experiences things that they will experience or have experienced, and to validate that. So, and to teach them, how do you negotiate this world that isn't always kind, and negotiate this world that is going to judge you just based on before you even open your mouth. Right. So that was kind of the idea behind it. People really want to get involved. So it's a matter of just getting those matches and working with caregivers, because they're still a part of it, especially depending on the age of the child. Like, you know, coordinating the getting. So it's really, what do they do? Simple. We have one who they have really brought that person into their life, that child. So they go to the movies when we could go to the movies. Okay. they still connect with them virtually. Like some in care, a lot of kids unfortunately move. And so this person stays with them. And so the idea is, yes, a minimum of 1 year, but ideally this would just be a part of your family. You become the family together, and in a different way, and supporting the family that child is in. It's a lot of talking.
Yeah, I think when you were, that's amazing. And I think when you were talking about all of this, I just kept thinking about, like, as the foster parent or the adoptive parent who isn't from that culture, so as a potentially a white family adopting a child from a different culture, like the lessons that we could be learning, that the parent, the foster parent, can be asking those questions as well. So it's almost like the auntie is for the child, but potentially for those parents as well, to say, like, how do I address this? Or, all these, there's so much, like, how do I prepare, children for interaction with police? Because me as a white person, that's going to be very different, and my perceptions are going to be very different. So I can see that being like a huge resource.
And I see them just also, maybe that's the person who has the conversation to start with. And you're a part of it. They bring you into it, or you have it, all of you. Like, I mean, that can happen in so many different ways. Like, you think about when people have children and if they're fortunate to have extended family, or if they're fortunate to have close friends, those relationships, like, my son has my mother, which I think is amazing, because he has a relationship with her that I didn't have with my grandmother. And just to see them, and they have their own little they have their own little world, right? Like, they connect, they do their thing. What do you want to do? I don't know what I want. Like, it's quite comical now, but that someone could also have that with another adult, a healthy relationship, and not it being like a lesson. Okay, today, George Floyd was murdered, so we're going to talk about that. No, just how does it naturally come up? And if they're able to be in the home of that person who is the auntie or uncle, there's a lot of things they're going to pick up that isn't necessarily the sit down, here's my whiteboard, and walk you through how you're going to be Black in this world and survive.
One.
Right? But there's even conversations that my son hears, because we're Black people experiencing the world. So we'll talk about things, and there's things that I will always say, if you have a child in the home and you don't want them to hear something, don't say it in the house. I don't care if you think they're sleeping, they're not sleeping. Right? You were all kids. You just knew you shouldn't bring it up because you weren't supposed to be listening. But there's conversations that he hears about what mommy does, what mommy's work is. And how it's not just about Black. So he knows how mummies, they're also talk about oppression of other identities. He understands that. He knows that our home, and we have friends who are of different identities, Black, white, Indian, gay, like all of that is in the mix. So he's getting that learning. So I'm thinking, if we were an auntie or an uncle and come to our home, that's the same things that they would be picking up. So how do we walk in the world? How do we deal with these things? I overheard so-and-so saying that this happened at work for them. Well, I'm 9, I don't have a job, but I go to school. So if this is important for them, then that means, so Macklin will bring things to us and say, this happened at school, right? Where some kids might not. If they don't think their care provider is equipped, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but that they just don't have that experience. Yeah. They might not, they want to protect them as well. Right. So Macklin knows he can bring whatever it is. So I'd want other children and youth to have the same thing. So I always think, well, what would I want? What do I want for my son? That's what I want for the kids in care. That's what I want for the children and youth that are adopted. And that's not to take away from what those families can provide, but there is something about when I was 6 and my mother said, what happened at school? I said, well, this kid called me the N-word. Back then we would have just set up and, we're on live. Don't want to get you in trouble. And so she didn't say, well, don't listen to them. She didn't say sticks and stones will hurt break your bones, but names will never hurt you. That was never true. I'd rather someone just broke my bone, right? Like, we said it, it's done. Names and words do hurt. And so there's a point where she didn't say anything, because she told me a story about how she was treated when she left Jamaica and went to England. So we sat with that. So I could trust that you get this. Okay. And you're okay. I'm going to be okay. But there's certain things that we will do to address this, right? And that being legitimized, as opposed to a parent who's not of the same race might not feel it's their place to challenge if it happened at school, or if it happened at a sporting event, right? Who am I? Or maybe it's okay. Maybe they're not saying anything about it right now. They're okay, when really they're not. They just know that you need them to be okay, right? So for someone to say, no, I've experienced that. So how do you channel that and make that something that helps I think, nourish and feed their identities in a positive way. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. So this is, I feel like this is just like an admin kind of question, but I want to make sure I get through it. Like, so right now you've said that you've made a couple of kind of matches with the program.
Yes.
So this program is designed for children who are currently in extended care, or like, could anyone come to you?
Oh, no. No.
Can I come? No.
Like, how far reaching is this Facebook Live? Yeah. Come on, Catherine.
We're going to give you Michelle's personal phone number and you call her, everybody.
Yeah, listen. Okay, so it's a pilot. So right now what we tried to focus on is children and youth in care, Black children and youth in care. However, we have gotten calls like from Elgin Children's Aid Society saying, hey, and those are smaller agencies. So really the idea is that we would then also be able to provide sort of that service, but really wanting to focus on Black children, youth in care. The person, Shalini, who's really been instrumental in this, has come up with measures. So how we want to measure this. So we're measuring, you know, from how is their feeling about their identity on a scale. And after, 6 months with this auntie or uncle, is there an improvement in how is there a positive improvement in how they see themselves and how comfortable they are? And so that's asking the child or youth. It's like, I think she's got like 5 questions. So it's nothing like, but really she's researched it to say, okay, these questions will get at that, so that it's not this long survey that we're asking like a 9-year-old to fill out, right? So we want to hear from, especially in the beginning of it, we want to hear from the child, the youth. We want to also be hearing from if their worker that's involved, because there'll be things that they see. The care provider. So if they're in an adoptive, like leading to adoption, if it's a foster home or wherever they're, it could be with kin who also aren't the same race. So wanting to kind of hear from all of those and compile that to say, okay, because everyone's empirical data. Anecdotal is great, but that's what's also going to move it, that this we have seen a significant shift. So we checked it at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and then hopefully at 18 to see how this is working. And then ideally that it's not housed in children's aid, because they really see it as sort of like big brothers, big sisters in a different way. And then after that, I mean, after we've taken out of there, well, you can do so many amazing things with it, because then we're talking about matching children and youth based on their identities. So if they identify as gay, if they identify as from Indigenous communities, how are we doing that? So this is where it started, because we're connected with One Vision, One Voice. And really wanting to see, okay, what's working, what's not working, how do we fine tune this, and then provide a report, or someone said a manual or something, so people can really look at what were our successes, what are the challenges, because there's challenges, and just how do you do it, and really want it to do justice. So it's not complicated, but I think it's just being intentional about that.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense, because if you open it up too quick, you open the floodgates, then we'll be referring everyone to you now. You open the floodgates and then it's harder to kind of control, and if there are blips, or
right,
things you can kind of
right
as you go and figure out how best. And so for the aunties and uncles, is it the hopes that they would, I guess they don't need to go through Pride or anything, this would just be volunteers
so that was the question. So yeah, so it's volunteers. So what we've done so far is I just got a call. This is a funny thing. I got a call literally on Friday that I need to call back. So someone I don't know where they saw it, maybe because I did something on Facebook in a small group in London. But anyway, so it would be an initial call. Now I love that we can do virtual as long as people are comfortable with that, because after the call, I'd want to meet with people. Like Shalini we'd do a sit down. Sometimes it's like usually, I'm not going to lie, usually it's about an hour and a half. Because it's really getting a feel for who that person is, having them really feel and trust who we are, and sort of what it is that we're wanting to do and what the purpose is, giving them sort of a general idea of what children's aid is, because a lot of people, unless you've had direct contact, you really don't know. And a lot of the information that's out there, is negative.
Yeah.
Right? People who receive good service from Children's Aid, usually it's the people who adopt there, because then it's just like, look, I was there because, as opposed to we had struggles. So they're not the ones who are standing on the top of the mountain screaming how great the service was, even if it was. And a lot of people do have that experience, how we were able to help them negotiate their way back to being, a parent without us. So we sit down, we have that conversation. There's an application for them. There's a volunteer application for them to fill out. Then there's one very specific to being an auntie and uncle that really just looks at, like, how do you identify? What's your cultural background? How do you're really wanting to trace it back, like your grandparents from, like, so if they say they were from Jamaica. So we get really, what is the lineage here? Because some people just identify, I'm Canadian, but I really want to understand what your cultural and ethnic background is. And so they fill that out. They obviously do the police checks and then the confidentiality. So all of that sort of administrative stuff that we'd have general volunteers fill out. And then we've created just sort of a training, and it was it was under 3 hours, about 3 hours, but really just to, again, give people an idea of what Children's Aid's about, some of the challenges that some of the children and youth and families are coming with, some of the things to be mindful of, and just sort of how the system also works, like who has a worker, because that can be very confusing. Who is a worker? What's their role? Who will they be sort of interfacing with and connecting with? And so giving an idea about that. And so I'm always amazed that people come and they have limited information about Children's Aid and they just trust to come, which is great. But giving them that, and then giving them a better understanding of what the aunties and uncles, there are certain things we want you to focus on. And it's not having it come about organically, or maybe something, there was a murder and we need to talk about this. Yeah. Right? But really saying we want to hit the fact of affirming their racial and cultural identity. Like we want those things hit. So that's kind of the starting phase. And then we connect with what are the referrals that have come in for the child or youth. And it talks about interest. So we don't just match people because you're Black. Like, right there you go. Like if there's someone says, I'm interested in the guitar, or I'm interested in this, so we try to also put that into play. And then after meeting with the worker, talking to them about it, then going out and talking to the child or youth about it, and if they have questions. And then there's a meeting that we also participate in where they kind of come together and then figure out, okay, what's that going to look like moving forward? One of them, the child had, I think, was swimming like every Wednesday. They had swimming at the Y here. And so that auntie, that's how it started. She was there. And then would take the child home. She was the person who, when they came out, when they're wet and they come out, that's the person who had the towel. Right. So that was, so that's kind of the trajectory of it. And then in that, we also want to be able to bring aunties and uncles together so that they can talk about their experiences and then create that sort of support for them. And then just also providing them sometimes with some educational pieces. Like if you're not in this field, like if it's social work, psychology, or anything like that, we had one where the auntie's like, okay, I keep calling. It's like, she's not calling back. Like, I'm not sure what's happening. And it was the child had moved again. And I think that, and we said, our person, Shalini, who's also a social worker, just kind of broke it down and said, I think she's trying to test you to see if you're going to leave, because she's moved so much and people will leave. So just be consistent and persistent. And she was, and she was like, okay, we're back to where we were. So just taking time, because if this isn't sort of your area, it's not your wheelhouse, you're just thinking, okay, I must have done something. Maybe this isn't a good match. And just being able to have that support for them to understand, like, no, this is kind of sometimes the course we're going to take, and that they're going to make you take because they need to make sure they can trust you. Yeah. So they're going to test you. And this is one of those things that they would do. Yeah.
I apologize. My internet is cutting out. So I got the gist of what you said. So Chantel, flag me if I just total robot on everybody.
Don't worry, Michelle, I was listening.
Went, had a cup of coffee.
Well, as long as everyone else could hear.
Yeah, but everyone out there heard everything.
It was the best. It was the best stuff I've ever said.
I was trying. And so I preface that because I apologize if you've already kind of answered this.
That's okay.
The bit that I've missed. So like in listening to like the varied roles that aunties and uncles can have, then is there, like, there doesn't seem to be like a set age range or someone has to be at this point in their life. It just depends that someone is obviously stable and they have experience, but like, is it,
Well, and
you're
even
looking more for the connection or?
well, it's more of the connection. I think we did the cutoff at 21. Just that there's some like life experience, right? So we did do 21, and right now we've tended to get people who are a little bit older, but that kind of has been the cutoff. And I suppose just lived experience, right? Not that you have to have had a child, not to maybe you haven't even been an auntie or uncle, but you've worked with children in some way that you know that you, like really that this is something, because kids can be very trying. So at least that you think, yeah, this is something I've worked with kids. I did camp, or I just, I played with my nieces or nephews, and I feel like I have something that I can give back. I feel that I have, something. So stable in the sense that you're not moving. Like someone had called before and said, well, I'm planning on moving back to Toronto. And it was like in 3 months. This was pre-COVID. And I said, that's not really going to work. So let's see how we might be able to utilize you in a different way. If the child was older, or do you know what I mean? Like that they were going to be going off to school. And so you would just have to connect and figure out where you would meet. That would be fine. But to form that relationship, it was really about spending that time. So there isn't necessarily, and then we've had varying. We've had ages, I think someone was sort of late 20s. We even had early 20s. We had in their 30s, someone who's in their 40s who has teenage kids. So it varies, and they all bring different things. And we had someone else who was at the age of a grandmother. And so we also wanted to be very mindful of what would be the best match, right? So this person would be playing very much sort of a grandmother sort of figure, and what child would be a good match for both, so that we're not setting up grandma. Right? So wanting to be very mindful and very intentional about that, and taking in the information that's provided and that we have access to about the auntie and uncle, because there was times, I think, when Shauna had made a match and she said, okay, I made an executive decision. I pulled it back on that one, because a challenge that child was having at 10 was a challenge that auntie had identified, and we weren't really clear where they were at with that. So we kind of pulled back and just said, it's not going to be a good fit. So we're going to wait for the next referral. And it was the best call that was made, just based on different. And so really having people be honest about where they are. And then we ask them, like, some people say, I'm great with like toddlers, or I'm great with teens, but I can't do 8-year-olds. That's good to know. I mean, it's not like literally a checklist, but it's good to know, because each age, as we know, comes with different challenges and different needs. So if you start off when they're here, that's easy. But if you jump in and your experience with teens or your level of comfort isn't really there, then I would say we just hold and we just wait, because there'll be lots of kids.
Yes. Well, especially with all the referrals we're going to be giving you. So exactly.
Yes, Catherine. Catherine will be coming on and assisting with the program.
Sure. Of course we will. So I'm mindful we have 15 minutes, and I have heavier questions.
Okay.
Not heavier, but questions. So feel free to answer this with your comfort level. I mean, I'm going to ask them. So we talked about transracial adoptions and white families raising children, more specifically, say for talking about the Aunties and Uncles program, white parents raising Black children in transracial adoptions. I mean, we talked about this before we kind of went live, about this being culturally competent. And that in itself has its own little, what actually does it mean to be culturally competent? But, for parents, adoptive families who aren't a part of the pilot project, who aren't in London, like, what can parents do, especially transracial white parents adopting Black children? What can they do to help support kids in their identity? It's such a big question.
It's not. I think it's the question that should always be asked. And I think it's the question that anyone who has adopted or is considering adopting transracially you're going to have to really step outside of your comfort zone. You have to, because ideally, in an ideal, like Michelle world, kids will be matched with they're just because this is the world we live in, this is the world they walk in, there are certain things that they just needs to be instilled in them to survive, to thrive, and to feel proud about who they are, as opposed to just being the exception, right? So if you're the only one in that family, you are the exception. And some people who interact with your family will see you as the exception and might see you as the child who got rescued by this lovely white family. And then you actually internalize that, right? And so then you start to see Black people, or I'm going to say Black people, who look like you as different. And now you don't even have that level of comfort when you, and people have said this, they don't feel comfortable when they're with people who look like them, because they've missed out on sort of those cues and things, and just that level of comfort with that. And so I go back to the adult. There is no excuse not to educate yourself. I mean, we talked about this, get phone. And not everything is Googled, because here's the reality. Like, yes, my family is Jamaican, but I was also born and raised in Canada. My mother was born in Jamaica, went to England. Different, so she has a good understanding of having to negotiate different spaces. And my father, when he was alive, he came directly from Jamaica. So different experience. But I'm not the same as my husband, who was born in Jamaica, came at 9. Right. So I can't just, I'm putting that out there that we're not all the same. Okay. But you do have, I think, if you decided that this is the child that you want, then to me, you also decided that then you are going to go and chase down their culture. And not everyone's going to be welcoming, because they will see possibly that you took. Yeah. And they have their perception, they don't know you. And you just need to deal with that. and I say that not nonchalantly, but just the fact that this is kind of what you signed up for. Yeah. And there will be people who are welcoming if they see you as genuine and authentic in going after and embracing. Does it mean you got to go get some friends from that culture? Yes. I don't expect you to be the expert. You cannot be the expert. Like, I can't be the expert in being a white woman or a white man. I have a different advantage, though, because I grew up and I am raised in whiteness. So I have this duality that also gives me that I know. I've watched like TV, everything. You know, I grew up in the 70s in Canada. So everything was white. You went to the grocery store, everything was what white people were eating. And we had to go certain places to special grocery stores to get foods that were from our culture. So I put that out there that you do have to really, and make it an organic, natural part of your home, not the one-off. Not that you go into the child's room, if they're Indigenous, let's say, and there's the dream catcher. Not that there's the one painting that you bought when you went to the one powwow, you know, or it's I don't know, it's orange shirt day. And then we
shirt, you're good.
Right?
One shirt, we're good.
Right. Or, you know, I took the child to the festival in the park. Like, we have Victoria Park here, where when pre-COVID, there's all different festivals. And one is Sunfest, which is all these different nationalities and cultures coming together and saying, well, we went to, you know, the Jamaican stand, the kids Jamaican, and we picked up a patty. And then they sat and they danced to the music. Well, it was a Ghanaian artist. It wasn't even Jamaican. Like, what are you talking about? So really taking the time to understand that. And then my biggest thing, like, it's so easy. You can get it on YouTube. Listen to an adult adoptee talk about growing up in a transracial home. And please don't just listen to one that just fits the narrative that you want. Like, because their experiences are all different, and depending where they are, and if there is some internalized oppression and racism that plays into it, and then they will say, this was perfect. You know, I was the only Black child in my family, but it was great. They never saw color. It was never an issue. That cannot be true. That cannot be true. So really listening to adoptees who have been raised in transracial, and listen to also their pain. Because some will talk about how they went to find their biological family, but they didn't tell their adoptive family. So how hard is that? So I've gone to, maybe it was NACAC, some conferences, and I just sat there and thought, thank you for sharing, because that informs what I do. Right. And it helps. And I'm hoping that parents listen to that, because it matters. Like, I think, what are you going to tell them at 25? Like I always say, my cutoff is always 25. Like, you're not grown until you're 25. This is what happens when you get older. I thought I was grown at 25, right? 25. And now I'm like double that. But I really look at when they really stop, like you're either working, you've gone to school, or you've doing these things, you're negotiating your world and realizing, I don't feel comfortable in spaces where people look like me. What was that about? What did children's aid do? Why didn't they really instill it? Well, yeah, I said at 15 I didn't want to, but at 15, what do you know?
You don't want to do anything with your parents at 15, regardless.
Well, I think of my friend who's Italian, and she balked at that. We're the same age, that when growing up she had to go to Italian school on Saturday mornings, right? And that she hated it. And I said, so we're older now. I said, you speak Italian fluently, don't you? She's like, well, yeah. And you can write and read it. She said, yeah. I said, she goes, okay, gotcha. I said, if they had listened to you, you wouldn't be able to do that and feel comfortable speaking to someone who might be Italian from a different region, right? Because you're only used to hearing your parents' dialect and whatnot, that you feel comfortable doing that because they said, this is what we know. At 15, you're like, no, I just want to hang out and sleep in like my friends.
My life, I have an Italian background.
So okay, see?
I feel you there. One of those awesome classes. And I think, like, when you were talking kind of about the experience of the adoptive parents, and I mean, I'm, kid and customary care or support organization. For me, what really hit home was like that being uncomfortable, but still doing it. And I think that if you're in a position and you're pushing yourself and you're maybe asking the wrong questions, but you're asking it, or you're going to the events and feeling awkward or something happening, if you're having those big emotions, for me, it's like, what a teachable moment for me. And like, why am I feeling this way? And if I'm feeling this way, how has other communities felt this entire time? So I think for me, and I've said, like, my children have an Indigenous background. So I go to these things and I'm so awkward and I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm asking all the wrong questions, but I still ask. And then I ask them to call me out on it. Cause I'll say, like, you'll get kind of like looks when I say something. I'm like, okay, tell me what, and it's in those moments that I find that I personally learn more. So I want to encourage other families,
like, learn more.
Be okay.
And they trust you.
Yeah.
Right. You're not coming here saying, I'm the white person who knows everything about your culture, or I don't have to do that. Like, they trust you. And you get a glimpse of what your child goes through. Right. How many spaces are they the only one? And how they've had to build up a resistance and a tolerance to that you're not even aware of anymore.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't until I started doing more equity training and having these conversations that I started tracking. What do you do on a day in, day out, Michelle, that is now just in your subconscious? When you go to the store, generally you're a polite person, but there's this, I need to be, right? You cannot see me as this, disrespectful, whatever, Black woman. And all of those things are in your subconscious. So when you walk in a room, you assess how many people are in this room that look like me, right? So I think it gives you a tiny glimpse into what it's like, but then people start to trust you as you enter that in an authentic, real way. And that sends such a message to your kids to see you, right? In that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how much growth comes on the other side of the fear, the discomfort, and then it becomes less uncomfortable. And then you just ask the question. Then they start asking you questions, right?
That I'm like, I have no idea, but let's call your elder.
Right.
Someone who knows the answer.
Yeah.
Dr. Google can't help in some of those instances.
It's a good start.
It gets the books.
Yes.
And it gets the resources, and it gets Amazon, which can give some good things as well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think I just want to say that your point about looking for voices, materials and things that don't specifically align with what you ideally want to happen. Like, you need to hear different perspectives, different opinions, different ideas.
Yeah.
Sorry, Kevin, I know we have more questions.
Sorry, I have a bit of a lag, so I'm just talking, and I talk a lot, so I'm just talking. And I'm totally putting in a plug here, and we have no specific affiliation, but when I went to, I saw the documentary Adoption ID by Judith, and that was the most eye-opening documentary that I had seen. And this is just her perspective, but it was about a transracial adoptee and her journey going back to Haiti and trying to research where she came from. And I know for me, it was the beginning of my own kind of personal reflection and journey. So if you haven't seen it, again, there's no reason why I'm sharing it other than I personally really enjoyed her.
I wrote it down because that's the.
Oh, you haven't seen it? Oh my God.
I haven't seen
you have to see it. It's Judith. Oh my gosh. Judith Craig Morrissey is the adoptee, and she does a lot of great speaking events too. But I remember watching it and it was just like, oh, there it is. Like just truth and honesty. So, okay. We have 4 minutes, so I'm being mindful. So, talk fast. Joking. So I mean, okay, overarching. I'm not going to drop a big bomb, but like, how
bombs?
We'll
Let's do it.
So, I mean, anyone who's involved within the child welfare, anyone, whether it's from us or people who actually work in child welfare, we know that there's overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous children of youth of color. How do we actually, such a big one, you have 4 minutes, 3 minutes. How do we actually support people in meaningful ways in this? So we know this is a thing. How can we actually make an impact on this? Because I feel like if I'm just a mom or a dad, or I'm just a regular person maybe watching this, and I'm now aware of so many overarching issues that happen, and there needs to be big systematic changes, but like, how do we actually as individuals support this and support children and youth in care and help make changes?
I think for me, it's always starting with the person. And I know this annoys some people because they want this big plan, but you can't move a plan unless you know who you are, unless you know your identity and how it is without, unconsciously, whatever, complicit in perpetuating these stereotypes, these forms of oppression and the privileges that you have. Not just saying, because there's this one thing, did everybody read, Peggy McIntosh's, unpacking the white knapsack, right? Some people had to read that in school. They read it like, okay, I get it. You had to go somewhere else to get your shampoo and get your hair done and all, right? And it's still at this superficial level. No, but how have you benefited from these? Because I can't really enter into this conversation with you because we're going to talk about identities and we're going to talk about your white identity in this. So it's important for you to do the work. Like there's so many things to read to have a better, deeper understanding and understanding history as to how we got here. Like none of this is by accident. The overrepresentation of Black children in care is not by accident. It is totally based on a system that is racist. Like I work in a system that is racist, right? And Indigenous, well, we can just go start the Indian Act. We can talk about like the genocide. But really having an understanding of to how people got to some of the space, the places that they're in, and now how your identity plays into that, and even you unknowingly playing into that. Because unless you can identify that, when we start talking about plans and strategies, you're coming at it with this one lens. And so then when you have someone who, we put those two groups, it's Indigenous or Black, coming and speaking at the table, the strategy might be foreign to the predominantly white people.
Right.
And therefore fragility kicks in and they push back.
Yes.
Eventually, those people leave the table. You can't hear it because it's different, because it's asking you to challenge, and sometimes challenging your position, challenging decisions that you might have made. So how do you move forward? So I think doing that. The other thing is have conversations. Start off with your safe people. Right? And then have conversations with people who are not of the same identity with you. Because here's the thing, here's the secret. We're having these conversations all the time. Right?
Yeah.
So for me to come when George Floyd died and to talk about it, when I was asked to talk about it within our agency on a video, it was emotionally charged because I really hadn't processed it until then Friday hit. And then I was asked to do this video, and I was like, wait a minute, what's happening? But generally speaking, we have these conversations. Like my husband will talk about, oh, we finally get an equity council at our place of work. He's in the private sector. And he's like, so my son overhears these conversations. So when I sit down with someone who is Indigenous, we have these conversations. when I used to do frontline, when I sit down with someone, they're Black, they said, you know, this such and such was racist. And I said, probably was. Okay, let's talk about that. As opposed to saying, well, I'm here to talk about the protection concern. No, I'm taking you in your totality. Let's address that. So I think doing the work, there's so much stuff. There's YouTube stuff. I'm 1 minute over. Sorry. There's YouTube.
Okay.
I can talk forever. There's so many things that are easily accessible.
Yeah.
To just start it if you're not comfortable having that conversation with people. But then I challenge you to do that and then talk about how can you be instrumental in this, because everyone has a sphere of power within their sphere of influence, even if it's a little thing. So
thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Such a big
question,
but I think it needs to be addressed. And I think what my biggest takeaway from that was so many people, I'll speak for myself, think of it as a huge systems, and I can't touch that. It says I'm not political, I'm not an MP, so I can't touch that. But from what I'm hearing is actually doing the work from ourselves is what's going to impact the system. And so talking about the overrepresentation, talking about those things, as being uncomfortable and asking questions that might not come across, like we have to be okay with having those discussions. And I appreciate you having this discussion with us and for sharing your knowledge. I feel like we could have talked for about another hour.
Probably 3.
I love it.
I want to thank you. Thank you for, this has been a pleasure. This is one of my joys. If it just makes a difference for one person that they think something differently, or they think, maybe I'll think about that a little more, then it's well worth it. And I could talk to you guys for, like I said, another 3 hours.
I love it. So we'll definitely have you back when the pilot project research is done, because we love to hear more about it.
Great.
And then
Thank
obviously
you.
how you'll be implementing it provincially as well as the next step.
Right.
No, thank you. So next week, I just to wrap up as well, because I want to be mindful of your time, Michelle. Next week, we are talking to Cheyenne Ratnam. Cheyenne she's a fantastic woman that I know personally as well. She's a part of the OCAC, and so which is, Chantal, I might get this wrong, the Ontario Children's Advancement Coalition. And so we're talking about her organization and all the amazing things that they're doing to our community, for our community, and for children and youth in care. Am I missing anything, Chantal?
No, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
I kind of just don't want this to end. I'm just kind of dragging it on, right? All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Everyone.
Take care. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.